the Supply and Chain Podcast with Leo and Kristine.
Hi guys, we are very excited to welcome Gopal today. Gopal is London-based supply chain transformation expert covering domains from retail, FMCG up to public sector. He previously consulted the government of India for developing a first-of-its-kind business excellence framework. Welcome, Gopal.
Gopal, welcome to the Supply and Chain Podcast. So let's start with our first question. Who is responsible to drive the sustainability in supply chains?
That's an interesting question, Leo, because more you talk to people, you get very different answers about sustainability. I remember the time when I first stepped into any organization as my first corporate job, and sustainability used to sit comfortably within the HR and the CSR kind of function at one point, and that's where it was taken up. Now, obviously, that was an offshoot of the Industrial Revolution, how HR used to get involved in it. Yeah. But as things have evolved, people have rightly realized that sustainability is everyone's job. It's a part of everyone's job description. You can't really expect someone sitting in one part of the business to look after the sustainability across the value chain. And hence, it is best answered if people are being more responsible and more sustainable in their own areas of work. And that definitely has worked very well. If you talk about some of the leading companies who have been talking about sustainability, maybe if I can throw a few names out there, and I know every company that I'm going to use an example over here, it would have a positive and a negative story. But people like, if you talk about the Nestle's of this world, or if you talk about the Burger Kings of this side of the world and stuff, you definitely find sustainability being ingrained in everyone's JD, as I said, or job description, as I said. So if you ask me, Leo, I think it's everyone's role and responsibility. If I'm looking after a factory, I need to be very sure that the operations within the factory are sustainable. If I'm sitting there in the boardroom, I need to make sure that I'm able to communicate the right policies out there. I'm able to make sure that it's just not a boardroom conversation. However, if I'm talking about suppliers or even customers, then I need to make sure that sustainability is covered in that area. So that's where my take would be.
Gopal, we have a question based on the previous answer. Let's imagine that you are tasked to create this new generation supply chain, which is sustainable, transparent. What would be the roadmap? How would you go about creating that?
I think it needs to start from thinking where you want to be. What exactly do you want to do? Because more you talk about sustainability, you get very different answers. For some people, it's about the people who are involved in manufacturing or in the operations. For some other people, it might be measuring the carbon footprint and making sure that we kind of don't harm the environment as much as we generally do right now. And for some other people, it could just be about managing the profitability across the chain and making sure that the businesses and the supply chain network as a whole is sustainable. I think the classic definition which comes up is about around the triple bottom line that, Leo, I know we spent a lot of time while we were at Cranfield around it, where we looked at the triple bottom line, looking into the entire holistic view of sustainability. And if you look into the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, which are kind of taking a lot of spotlight now, I think it is quite clear that the definition of sustainability is much wider than what people have been talking about for a while. If I need to put up a roadmap for sustainability, I think it would start at the top. It would first of all start by strategizing that where exactly I'm going to be, how am I going to be reaching a particular objective, what do I want to achieve as a part of sustainability. I think that needs to be set up at the top. In parallel, I would also start up something around supply chain mapping because I think there was CIPS in UK came up with some statistics some years ago, and I'm very surprised if they have changed immensely. It's less than 10% of the companies actually know how their supply chain looks like when you go tier 2, tier 3 and beyond. That is actually a very scary kind of number because you're really exposing. It is just UK you're talking about. If you talk about other countries and you add everything up, I think we are sitting on a ticking time bomb here. But, well, anyway, so I think the mapping the supply chain becomes quite an important element as well to understand how the product, how the information and how the cash essentially is flowing across the whole thing, because that definitely would have a very strong lead into how you manage sustainability eventually. The third point which come up is having kind of certain definitions around what we are trying to measure, because again, if we don't measure, we don't improve. But before measurement, we need to communicate the right definitions around it. What are we trying to measure and why are we trying to measure onto this? It's really important to get people excited about the whole theme about sustainability. Now, there would be companies out there who there's a word which goes around saying greenwash, which is just about kind of doing it for the sake of just doing it. We need to move away from that particular psyche, and we need people to realize that it is more than that element. So that communicate element becomes an important one. The next item which would come on the list is putting up the right measurement techniques in place so that everyone who is measuring it is measuring in the same way in the supplier network. And once you're done with that, you obviously come up with a lot of the low-hanging fruits and even the more complex programs that could be built around it. But I would like to top everything up with the last step, which would be celebrate. I think sustainability definitely, and for that matter, any improvement project that you take, it only sticks, and it is sustainable, and that's another use of the word sustainable here, but it only sticks till the point you're able to communicate back to the people that what impact it has had in the lives of people, in the lives of the people that we are touching through the supply chain. And I think celebrating your successes becomes as important as keeping a check and program management on it. So in a nutshell, that would be my map to glory.
Do you have any good examples from other market players you could share regarding a good mapping and good KPIs, which are actually making sense instead of just being greenwashing activity?
Oh, definitely. Now, again, if we look at triple bottom line, if I go back to that particular example of that particular philosophy, you could have KPIs for each and every area. I would struggle to find one company who have done great across the spectrum, because I think everyone is kind of learning and it's not a particular things. So, for example, years ago, while I was in Malaysia before 4C Associates, where I am right now, we were doing some work for Nestle out there. And when we were we ran a transport operating model review for them, and we were out to the market to get the right suppliers and stuff. Now, when you're selecting a supplier, you technically would go out and do some weightages across the various criteria for selection. One thing that we got fed back from Nestle was that you need to give about 30% of your weightage to certain sustainability-related factors. Now, that 30% is a huge number. I have seen a lot of companies doing 4%, 5%, even 10% if we talk about how the UK public sector is currently working, where you have to measure social value. However, when you go back 10 years now from that particular date, and 30% of your focus was on sustainability. That really speaks measures leaps and bounds. Now, I know there were reasons for that, because the cultural setup in Malaysia is so diverse. You have got people from the Chinese descent, you've got the Indian descent, you've got people celebrating different festivals at different times of the year. So it's quite important to maintain the diversity just to keep the operations going. But at the end of the day, these are some of the elements that kind of help the company's operations anyway. At the same time, if I cut down to now, recently we had been working with Burger King here in the UK. And I think it's a publicly available document where they talk about their Scope 2 and Scope 3 supply chain targets. And they are focusing heavily on reducing the reliance on carbon footprint. Now, that's also driven a lot by regulation, because I think the food, or should I say in this case, the restaurant industry is can be questioned when it comes to how it's managing the waste, how it's managing even the deliveries and smaller deliveries they're getting, and so many things around sustainability. So that becomes quite important as well to understand how are they measuring it and how are they actually working with the suppliers and making things happen. You got some other companies like Provenance, for example. That could be one of the examples where they are using blockchain and similar technologies in order to help companies map up the entire journey of your product. So we were working with one of the retailers in Netherlands some time ago, and they were implementing blockchain for orange juice. Now, I know blockchain, it has been a widely used term, and in many cases, it's not been made very clear to the people who are actually going to be using it what exactly it means.
Exactly.
But in this case, they were able to come up with an entire traceability of their entire orange juice supply chain just by scanning the QR code. Now, that was about 5 years ago, and that time it was just taking off. And now there are a lot of other companies who are doing a similar thing. So I guess there could be examples and snippets which could be kind of spread across the globe, which could be brought together to understand the whole concept of sustainability. But Kristine, I'll go back to the point that I would struggle to find a single company which would tick all the boxes across the globe.
Interesting that you mentioned blockchain. For people that for the few people, I suppose, that have been listening to every episode, we have guests that have actually that are in the wide range of what blockchain is, right? Some people are like super, we need it for everything. Some people are like, okay, we really need to figure out what's the best way to use the technology. And also we had a guest that mentioned that, okay, what do we want to use it for if just the power needed to enable this technology, it may create more damage than the good that you by tracing this little thing, but like you're tracing this little thing, but the cost of it is so high. Where do you stand, or what is a good rule of thumb of where should we aim our efforts regarding blockchain?
So I think if we cut back to 3 years ago, or even 2 years ago, there was a lot of focus on the proof of work and proof of stake kind of arrangements, which was definitely kind of giving a lot of, should we say, a lot of issues around sustainability definitely have been impacting blockchain because of that, because the amount of number crunching and amount of analysis that's required, that's way too much. But then the newer algorithms around blockchain are definitely looking at some of the, should we say, some of the sustainability issues on that. You're entirely right, blockchain cannot be used for everything in this particular case. There has to be, like any other transformation program, you need to understand the maturity curve, where exactly the organization lies and where exactly, when do they think and where do you think this particular element is going to be there. I think the magic of blockchain comes alive, if I can use that term, comes alive only when you have a substantial people who have a buy-in around it and you feel a substantial outcome coming around it. So if I take into account something like how the freight moves across the globe, there are so many different partners over there, and that does lead to reduction of waste in many forms. Like, for example, all the paper, all the administration which would go into it, that can definitely be streamlined. But if you're using blockchain just so that you can give kind of put another tick in your box out there, then definitely blockchain is not the answer. Also, blockchain for me is, in 2 words, it's a trust machine. So it helps building trust. If you think your supply chain already is pretty short, and if you think that you already have suppliers whom you can trust and who trust you, probably you don't need blockchain, because probably you're already at that point where blockchain would not add a lot of marginal.
The margin benefits really are not worth the effort and
that's where I would stand. And I know other experts who would come on the show, they would have their stand as well, and probably they would know better on blockchain than me because they are the practitioners around it. Yeah. But from my perspective, I think it is still a big question mark about how do we make this whole technology more sustainable.
So let's switch gears a little bit. We had our conversation on sustainability. Let's talk about collaboration, which again, it's one of the things. When we're talking about supply chain, it's all these links together, and really it makes sense. But in practice, it looks like a bunch of silos together that are called supply chain. So, how important do you think it's collaboration, and really how to reach it?
So again, going back to the Cranfield days here, I've been going back and kind of taking a lot of inputs from our days at Cranfield. One of the things that I think Professor Richard Wilding had mentioned was the T-shape.
T-shape, yes.
That was one of the first things that he said.
Shout out to Richard Wilding, yes.
Yeah, and I think that is still very valid, and I think that is one of the best examples that you can talk about. And at the end of the day, you do have your own operations to run and you have suppliers. If you have to come up with a transformation, any kind of program around it, it would be just impossible to kind of make it happen without collaborating with your suppliers and your customers. Mm-hmm. I think everybody agrees that people need to work together. But the reason it hasn't worked to the extent where I think is because it has always been kind of that win-lose kind of element where I ask my supplier, oh, Mr. Supplier, Miss Supplier, be more collaborative and help me deliver my product more efficiently. And I might not be caring about what my suppliers' costs are gonna be doing there or what's gonna happen at their end. As a result, the supply chain as a whole doesn't really win anything. It is just moving one part of the issue to other part of the supply chain. It's just like the game that whack the mole kind of thing game, right? Where you just hit the mole on one side and just pops up on the other. And that's exactly what has been happening. So if I kind of borrow another theory of the Krasik matrix over here, it's quite important to understand where you exactly lie in that particular mix. Now, that is important because it pays 2 ways. One is the spectrum where you and your supplier can together, or you and your customers can together create that collaborative environment where you can actually create that win-win kind of situation. And it's very important not to just look at the size of the spend and stuff, but also look into what is the strategy, what is the, should we say, core competence of those particular suppliers where actually things can actually happen. So that becomes quite important. So for me, it's going to be moving from that win-lose to kind of win-win kind of situation. Also, it's quite important for companies to realize that there are smaller suppliers in the mix who may not be seemingly very important for the overall set of spend that you have. Yeah. But even then, for your supply chain and for the global supply chain network, they are quite important. Yeah. So probably it's my responsibility as the larger player in the chain to kind of help them move to the next level and make sure that that happens. But I think there are three things which really need to be taken care of if you're really going to make collaboration work. One is investing in your infrastructure, not just in terms of capital, but also in terms of your human mindset and the capital about the thought process around things. Jointly manage performance. So you need to set up performance goals and make sure that jointly you are able to kind of manage the whole thing. And the third thing would be having that communication line set up so that everybody understands that what the impact has been for the changes that they have brought in. And I think unless and until we have these three things sorted out, I think collaboration would always be kind of just about their kind of thing, but you're never going to get amazing collaboration.
It's interesting because we're having all these conversations about customer relationship management or even supplier relationship management, but it becomes very a one-way street. You know, it's like I want more and I want to pay less, or I want you to buy more and I want to charge you more. But what are you giving? What is the exchange? And it that reflects really what happens within the company, right? Like we're talking about again, warehouse buying, retail. Sometimes people are looking at what is more convenient for them, and again, that's where we end up with situations like a bullwhip effect. Just because everybody's looking at their own, what do we need? I need more, so they just place a bigger order. So it's really this lack of collaboration that, again, it might look like a philosophy issue or just like, oh, we all need to work together, but really has financial consequences when you do, these things spirals out of control.
And just adding to that, Leo, I think one big example which comes up is the current freight situation which is there. So over the last many years, the shippers have been working with the freight service providers or even the people who own the ships to kind of push their costs down. And that industry had been struggling for a very long time. The margins were minuscule. As a result, they did succumb to it because they have to win business, but they didn't have a chance to invest back into their business. So an industry where technology was very much required because of all the murkiness around the administration and data and stuff, it never had the revenue or capital to actually keep investing in it. Because if you're buying a ship, it's a huge capital cost to start with. Yeah. And then trying to kind of fill it up, and then a lot of containers are not fully filled, and those are immense issues around it. And as a result, nobody is winning onto it. As a buyer of shipping services, I was like, yeah, fine, I've kind of met my savings target. But what has actually happened is I have actually stopped the shipping companies to actually invest in their own. Yeah. Now, cut to 2021, suddenly the rates are high. And if you talk about any of the firms, maybe CMA, CGM or Maersk, they are investing heavy on their own technology infrastructure, which is important. Yeah. And there is a lack of kind of capacity in the market, and they are kind of hitting back on this one. Yeah. And then there are issues. So right now, if you look into the latest rates, they're like 5, 6, even 10 times more what you're paying for a container to be shipped from East Asia into the UK, and it's a big issue. So it actually comes down. Life is a circle.
When we were studying about 10 years ago, that's how old we are, then the big thing about supply relationship management was like reverse bidding, like force your way into getting a supplier to go as low as they can, to feel the rush that they have 1 hour to get the lowest cost. And yes, you in the beginning you see like a reduction, a massive reduction of what you were paying. You can see the thrill of the suppliers doing whatever is possible to get your order, but that's not sustainable. What happened later was that to get that order, people were making a loss, and then you have to bail them out because they are making your product. So you actually have to help them to stay alive, because otherwise you're just going to lose the supplier. And really, that's just, as you said, it's just using that like a ball, just hitting it, and something else will come up. Instead of really seeing, okay, how we can make a collaborative effort with suppliers. Again, of course, there's a benefit. And again, not always 50-50 if you want to look at it that way, but you gotta keep them alive, and you gotta throw them a bone. I totally agree. Otherwise, you're just forcing your way and getting what you want, and you're calling a relationship. That's just
another point on that, Leo, is it's not just collaborating with your suppliers. At times, it's also collaborating with your own competitors. Now, I know that might kind of create an issue in some of the kind of circles that will be viewing this particular podcast. But then again, like for example, in the UK, right? Take this example again, the food service sector, the restaurant sector, for example, right? Now, there are a lot of legislations and regulations coming in that by 2025, 2030, you need to cut your carbon spend and you need to be more sustainable and so on and so forth. The 3PL industry, which serves the restaurant industry, is pretty limited. You've got one company which called Best Food Logistics, who are owned by Tesco now. They do about 18 or 19 of the very awesome high street brands, including people like the KFCs of this world, the Burger Kings of this world, and so on and so forth. And so there is common, and so it's very much dependent on that particular company over here. Now, if you look into the requirements that are going to change, that's going to be changing for every customer on that particular list. So it's quite important for the whole ecosystem, which includes Best Food Logistics and all the people all the customers who are over here, to collaboratively come over here and devise a way so that by 2025, 26 or 2030, they are in a position to kind of tick all the boxes that are required. So it's not just a matter of the 3PL working with the customer over here. It's with 3PL working with all the customers out here. Until the point everyone doesn't agree, it doesn't work out very well for the 3PL because it's a shared network. So they can't just keep taking the cost.
Everybody suffers the consequences,
I agree. So I think it's a much bigger question of collaboration over here, and people really need to kind of open up their arms.
Do you think companies will try still to look for new places to source their goods, or it would rather come back to the local small networks?
I think it's going to be somewhere between the two. New suppliers are always going to be, they're always going to try to search new suppliers, mainly for two reasons. One is definitely people want to keep improving their margin. That is always going to be a big concern. And with a lot of investment of the private equity money coming into a lot of industries, there is a bigger pressure for companies to kind of turn around and look at how much can they improve the margin onto it. And that would always be the case of it. But at the same time, I think people have started realizing that shorter the supply chain, better the supply chain. That reduces not just the kind of the whole planning, because at the end of the day, your safety stock and your planning is going to depend upon the length of supply chain. Your customers will be ready to wait or not wait, depending upon the length of supply chain and planning, all those metrics which would come into play. So I think there is definitely a lot of work being done right now to understand what is the optimal length of supply chain. However, having said that, there are a lot of products for which we are constrained. Like if you're looking at the semiconductor industry, a lot of the raw materials into the semiconductor industry lie either in Africa or around China. And so you will have to be reliant on certain suppliers for that particular perspective. You might have a specific product or specific need which might be built in a certain geography alone. Or you might have introduced a lot of investments, like probably, I know fashion industry gets a lot of flack for not being sustainable in certain times. But then if you look into, and you're with Lee and Fung, who do a lot of work out there in Asia, in East Asia and areas. So there's a lot of investment which has already gone in out there. So people will want to make the best use of the capacity which is available there. However, they could definitely start looking at different models, like what percentage of their suppliers need to be based out there. They don't need all their parts of the supply chain. I think there's a lot of analysis which is required to understand how can you realistically reduce the length of your supply chain. That would be for the question.
How about, just a quick question. How about your own experience from the food? Because that's normally the trend goes towards local, organic. How do you see from your experience working with?
I think a lot of it is also dependent upon what my customer wants. So if my customer wants halloumi, I have to get halloumi. And UK, unfortunately, doesn't produce a lot of halloumi. Everything comes from Turkey and Greece and the nearby areas. So we have to get it from there. I remember talking to a few people pre-Brexit, because that's one big thing which happened, one of the black swans which happened still happening in a way, if you ask me. Well, they used to buy halloumi from Turkey and Greece. And when Brexit hit, they're like, yeah, we are sorted. Now we are sourcing from a distributor in the UK. And like, no, you're not, because your distributor still sources from the same supplier or the same region out there. So your supply chain technically hasn't reduced. So as I said, there would be certain items which would be out there. I think what can be done in order to kind of deal with that is to introduce the new menus and stuff, or new offerings that companies can bring on the table. So, like, for example, if you're able to introduce more locally produced or locally influenced supply chain, at least a significant portion of it. And if you can influence the customers in moving their, should we say, their preferences to those products, then definitely that has an impact on it. But having said that, till the point that doesn't happen, the customer demand is going to rule where I get my products from. So even though there might be an intent, that might be an issue. Then again, that brings back to our previous point about understanding if this is the constrained kind of supply chain where I have to get this product from this part of the world, what are the other things which are feeding into it that probably I could utilize better? Is strategic stock a better option? Or is some other entity? A warehouse is if you ask me, a ship is a moving warehouse. So is that something that you can use? So there are so many different models that could be brought in. I think there's a lot of analysis, a lot of work which needs to be put into this area.
But Gopal, I find it interesting what you mentioned, right? Because you're saying, okay, as a company, as a brand, as a retailer, I want to reduce the risk of going to new locations or to far locations to get a specific goods, and I want to keep it local. Do you think that this is what is going to happen? Really, is that they are going to still source, but indirectly through importers, because then the risk is not theirs, right? If I'm in the UK and I buy from an importer in the UK, it's your problem how you get it in the UK, and I just buy from you, maybe a bit more expensive, but I don't have to run the risk of like, oh, there is a container stuck somewhere, or like there is this country shut down. It's your risk now, and I'm willing to pay for it.
So that we need to look at it in two ways. Risk-wise, yes, things like the availability and risk, those could be addressed by moving to distributors. But if you talk about the local and the global kind of proportion in your supply chain, that doesn't go away. Even if, and that's where it goes back to our halloumi example in the UK, where they moved to a distributor in the UK and they thought that, yeah, we are done. We are not sourcing anything from there. But no, your supply chain was still sourcing from a global supplier. And that's where it brings back to our point of supply chain mapping, which becomes even more important to kind of bring the whole thing through. But your point of reducing the risk, that definitely is something which can be addressed by this, yes. And again, you need to look into what kind of product is being sourced in. So, I think I'm sure you would have gone through. I think it was a supply chain game we played out there long ago, where we were trying to influence the entire network of a clothing supplier who had things like white shirts and who had very seasonal kind of products. Yeah. And then I think the best solution out there was to have a kind of a strategic stock holding point somewhere in Europe for stuff where you could have the lean kind of methodologies and kind of look into certain other places, or even kind of air freight if required for certain products which are very seasonal in this particular example. Yeah. So I think that goes back to the point of segmenting the supply chain to understand how does your supply chain segments actually work out on all terms like product, geography, who the customer is, how you're actually delivering it. And I think all these elements need to be considered if you're trying to come up with the right model onto it. It's not a straightforward answer.
Let's dream a little bit. Let's project into the future. And what do you think supply chains will look like in the next, 10, 20 years? What do you think are the next big things that are going to happen?
That's always an interesting question. I think the biggest thing for me is something that I called a don't touch supply chain. So what it would mean, that theory would mean is like the whole planning, the concept of planning will become very automated. Like if I look into my daily working, about 80% of my work is based on data and how data interacts. Data already sits in certain systems, and those systems can talk to each other with the current situation onto it. Now, based on the forecast, I might plan something that gets transported to or transmitted to our suppliers who plan something, and that gets transmitted to their work plans and their suppliers. Now, all this element, there is a big section which can be taken out. You could take away all the manual intervention out of it, and it becomes a don't touch supply chain. Essentially, it goes back to our concept, which I think Procter & Gamble and Walmart had at one point, which they termed CPFR, right? Which was collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment, where P&G could have a view on what is the stock availability of certain products at Walmart. Now, there was a person doing it. But again, that everything could in definition be entirely automated, where the demand flows automatically, production happens, or production plans are generated automatically, and it automatically reaches out to a lot of 3PLs or any delivery partners, which kind of bring it back. So I think that's going to be a big area which is going to come in. The second big area is going to come in is around the end-to-end view. I know that is kind of a piped dream as if we look at the current structure or current situation. But I would still be very hopeful that we would reach a point where we would have a much better end-to-end view going forward about what's happening. And if I'm buying a mobile phone, I should be able to tell not just that it was designed in California and made in some other place in China. I should be able to tell where exactly the products were, where did they come from, and in a sense, how many miners did I impact by buying this phone. And more we get through this kind of visibility, I think we would educate the customer to kind of make better choices about what's happening and what's not, kind of thing. But I think the more important thing, which is going to definitely change, is something around the capabilities and skill sets that come around the people who are managing the supply chain at this point. Because right now it is quite siloed, as you very rightly put it, and one organization doesn't really understand what the other side of the organization actually wants to talk about. But I think with more and more collaboration and more T-shaped, I think that's definitely going to be one learning where one function is going to be kind of understanding what the other function is going to be saying and doing. So for me, the capability and the competency within supply chain is going to become more generic and more widely understood, but also very technology driven.
All right, Gopal, thank you very much for joining us. A lot of dreaming, a lot of thinking today, and thinking of better days to come, and lots of plans it has for us. Hopefully it will keep us busy doing great things around the world. It's been great to have you with us, and hopefully you can return soon.
Thanks, Kristine. Thanks, Leo. It has been a pleasure speaking to you guys.
This was the Supply Unchained podcast. You can see more episodes on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Remember to leave a review, like, and subscribe if you want more content like this. See you next time.